So I will try to cover a number of points this morning. So first, how the foreland pre-existing structure can impact the deformation history. Of course, the coupling between the foothills and the foreland. When do you have a good coupling? When instead the two bodies behave independently. I will try also to recap what we can learn from the sedimentary infill and geometry architecture of the four-deep basin on the overall lithospheric evolution of those compressional systems. And it is too bad that Taras is no longer there, but I added some slides from the Mediterranean just to illustrate incipient subductions. So, and because we are here in Barcelona, and because something like 30 years ago, we had a very nice joint French-Spanish project on the Pyrenees, I would like to start with some documents from that time. And here you've got the North Pyrenean ecorse profile, which is nice because actually you can see beautifully the development of a foreland basin, the four-deep, with the flexure of the European lithosphere in front of the Pyrenean orogen, with a progressive deepening of the late Cretaceous tertiary basin there. Also, what is nice is that we've got a control at a crustal scale there, with basically isopachous crust from the foreland up to the thrust front here, you see, and with a very nice moho and layered lower crust. But when you move southward, you see that your moho becomes shallower and shallower. So it means that here we are still preserving in the autochtone the Cretaceous stretching, Cretaceous thinning of the European lithosphere. And of course, most of the alloctonous units here are made up of former Cretaceous basin, which has been inverted during the Pyrenean orogeny. What is nice also in terms of inheritage is that we've got north dipping events in the middle crust, which we interpret as Hercynian Variscan thrust. And also you can see here south dipping events that are well calibrated from wells, and they relate to post-Hercynian Permian extensional basins. So it means that after the Carboniferous orogen, we inverted negatively the former Hercynian thrust to generate those Permian basins. And instead, during the Cretaceous, we developed basins there which have been partly inverted during the Pyrenean orogeny. And of course, those data were processed with the tools we had 30 years ago, and we realized that we improved our softwares and that it would be worth to try to do a more modern, more robust processing of that, especially to try to illuminate better those relationships between the Permian and Variscan stuff, and also eventually to image the Cretaceous basins in the lower plate. So when we worked 30 years ago, of course, we had no way to depth migrate properly the profiles, and that was done by ray tracing. So it was limited anyway. And so now, finally, we could save those data. We were lucky because the tapes were not in that good shape. But right now, we've got a student from IFP school, Amandine Festucci, who is doing her training in Total, in Po, where she is depth migrating that northern profile. And I had discussions with Ramon and with Montserrat yesterday and the day before. And so they are interested to do the same thing on the Spanish side. So they need to find what happens with those old data. But it is clear that there, what we would be looking at, of course, again, the Hercynian thrust system. But you know that the Nogueiras here are made up basically of Permian strata. So the idea would be if we can improve the seismic image, if we can locate the Permian basins which are still preserved in the lower plate. So it means, again, there is work going on in that part of the world. And of course, it is very important to know what are the control, in fact, of that Hercynian thrust belt on the propagation of the Pyrenean wedge. So it doesn't impact the northern side, but probably it is controlling the Pyrenean architecture in the southern side. Also, here I took that picture from Dirk Newland, a colleague who worked with Shell, but then he was with Amsterdam University, and he developed very nice, I would say, sandbox model, where he had pressure captors in the box, and where you see that the pressure in the foreland is sometimes increasing, sometimes relaxing, and just because basically, when you've got a thrust moving, you don't propagate the deformation in the foreland. And instead, when you don't have motion along the thrust, that's the time where you put pressure on the foreland, where you develop layer parallel shortening, and where eventually you will be able to invert the foreland inherited structures. Of course, that's something also you can detect by other means, and we had Jean-Claude Hippolyte, who did his PhD with Jacques Angelier in the Apennines, looking at the paleostress. At the time when you've got a good coupling, then the sigma-1 direction is exactly the same in the foreland and the electron, and instead, when thrusts are active, eventually the sigma-1 is not parallel in the foreland and in the electron. So that has been proposed also to control the evolution of the Zagros thrust belt, and I took that picture. I don't remember, I'm sorry if it is Olivier, if it is Frédéric, or if it is Jaume, but the idea is there in that even before the final stage of collision, you could propagate part of the deformation into the foreland, and you could reactivate basement structures in the Arabian plate. And instead, of course, then you had skin tectonics controlled basically by the distribution of the Precambrian salt. And eventually, you know that in the Middle East, basically the salt is post-drift. You inverted those pre-salt basins, and you generated, again, a good coupling between the plate boundary and the foreland, and you refolded the basal décollement on the salt because you were inverting the pre-salt basins. So the structural grain from the Arabian plate, it is very obvious that you've got those Precambrian rift systems which are controlling the distribution of the Precambrian salt. And of course, more than that, you've got a general tilt of the Arabian plate. When you look in the west, you've got the rift shoulder of the Red Sea, where the Precambrian basement is exposed. And for those who will join the ILP meeting in Jeddah, you will have the opportunity to see the Precambrian thrust belt there with beautiful west verging thrust involving sedimentary rocks. And then you've got the development of the Zagros flexure, so the loading of the thrust belt, which develops the 4D basin. And so basically, all the Arabian plate behave as a monocline, where the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic eventually have been eroded in the west, and where instead they are deeply buried beneath the Neogene flexural sections to the east. If I'm zooming now nearby the Oman Range and Emirates, it is a subcrop map where I try to compile the isopac of the flexural sequence. So it is quite composite. You see, of course, the allochthon, the ophiolite in blue, the Awazina units in pink, and the depth to the platform. Here we saw the isobat. And I will show you some lines, one here in the northern part of the northern Emirates, one line here in Oman, and another line here in the Hormuz Strait. And you will see that, in fact, it is much more complex than a single flexure. And let's start with the northern Emirates. It looks like you've got a continuous sedimentation, a continuous loading of the Arabian plate, but in fact, it is not the case. We've got a number of wells, we've got paleothermometers, and we know that we've got a big jump in paleothermometers between the Neogene and the Paleogene. So we had an erosional event in between. And we have to explain why we had that erosion in the middle of the evolution of the forest. When you go to the south, it doesn't look as a 4D at all. the platform, Arabian platform that you can trace on the seismic here, is not dipping towards the thrust belt. In fact, it is dipping towards the foreland. And because of that, people thought in the early days that the Awazina log tone was gravitationally implaced. So it was pushed down because you had the dipping attitude of the basement. It is not the case. In fact, you had a nice flexure in the late Cretaceous time during the Paleogene, but because of the detachment of the slab, all the sphere has been pushed up, and so you destroyed largely the Cretaceous Paleogene foredip, and now, of course, it is in the sky. Okay? Now, if you move, so that's just the picture at a crustal scale, you see that those data from the Ministry of Energy of the Emirates, you don't see anymore any slab pending there, and that's because of that you've got the vertical motion. But you see also that a part of the late Cretaceous emplacement of the ophiolite, we rejuvenated somehow the northern part of the Emirates with out-of-sequence thrusting involving the Arabian platform during the Miocene, okay? And so it means that in the northern part, where we had those Neogene thrust active again, we were loading again the lithosphere, accounting for a new flexure. And of course, it is very well dated because there are a number of wells to calibrate the stratigraphy. And that line is just between the Emirates and the Zagros, so in the Hormuz Strait. And there, what you see, in fact, it is the old flexure, so the old Cretaceous Paleogene flexural basin, which has been rotated because of the slab detachment, let's say during the Oligocene. And then that foreland, of course, suffered a very strong erosion, but then because of the Neogene emplacement of the Zagros, you loaded again the lithosphere and you developed the Neogene foredip. Okay? So all those foreland records can tell you what's going on in terms of geodynamics, in terms of lithosphere processes. And of course, we would not be happy without stratigraphy. So I guess the way I would say Peter is working on thrust belt, we're looking at efficient tracks to try to quantify the erosion. Here we can quantify the subsidence just using the chronomarkers, the stratigraphic markers. Sorry. So that change in the motion, vertical motion in foreland basins, it is something which is very common. And here it is a line taken from the AG Explorer, new seismic from spectrum across the Adriatic Basin, where you know the dinarites were developing during the Paleogene, basically during the Eocene until the Oligocene. You had a beautiful Oligocene flexural sequence. It is in orange here, and you see that it has been rotated. And so probably after the Oligocene, you had a slab detachment, and you pushed up all the foredip. But you see also that here we've got a younger deformation, and that the carbonate platform from the dinaride has been partially inverted during the Neogene. So it's in multi-stage. So at a certain time, you had only the development of the flexure in the foreland. At another time, you were able to invert, I would say, basement-involved structures, pre-existing structures. Here, it is a line, I took it for Rob, I guess. It is just online with his talk from yesterday. It is a profile, it is a little bit compressed. Usually, I don't like that. But to discuss that change in the motion of the lithosphere, I guess it is just nice. Because you see the Cyprus arc in the north, the Nile Delta in that direction. And you see that you had the very nice, I would say, late Cretaceous Paleogene flexural basin. And then instead of thickening the sequences towards the thrust belt, you see that you are thickening further to the foreland. So probably because you had something happening at the lithospheric scale, either, I would say, delamination as proposed by Rob, or maybe some kind of slab detachment. which helped to push up the lithosphere. But you see that it was the vertical motion, upward motion, occurred prior to the Messinian. And instead, you see that since the Messinian, basically, it looks like, again, you are loading the forlorn lithosphere, and maybe it means that you are reactivating the Cyprus arc, and that you are increasing, again, the load applied on that lithosphere. We had a talk also on the impact of the East Pacific rise when it is subducted underneath South America, and where we had, I would say, strange motion on the Putumayo basin. I was looking in my files to try to illustrate that, but I'm sorry, I could not get the seismic. I've got a profile somewhere, but not with me. But here it is exactly the same. You can see that the 4D basin has been tilted recently. And instead of having, I would say, the top of the flexural basin dipping towards the thrust belt, it is dipping towards the cratonic part of South America. And so I guess it is impacting a lot the petroleum system. And here it is not in South America, it is already in North America, it is in Mexico. It is the Sierra Madre, Oriental, and it is the Chicontepec flexural basin, you see? And here it is the Golden Lane. It is the former Cretaceous platform. So it was at the sea level in the Cretaceous. And you see the amount of post-Oligocene subsidence towards the Gulf of Mexico. So if you want to know what was the architecture of the foredip at the time of the Laramia orogeny, you have to push back the platform at the sea level. And then you will see that you restore your flexural basin in an appropriate position, where instead of having the basement tilted towards the Gulf of Mexico, instead it is dipping towards the Pacific, you see? So it means that nowadays, the oil fields located at the front of the Cordoba platform, at the front of the Sierra Madre, they are not charged by the foothills, but in fact, they are charged by the source rocks which are in the foreland, which is quite unique, just because of that motion of the lithosphere. Okay, so now back to the Mediterranean, and here I wanted to speak with Taras on that. You know that you've got convergence between Europe and Africa, that you've got thrust belts between Iberia and France along the Pyrenees, that you are developing the Apennines, that you are developing the Telian Atlas. That was basically operating in the Eocene, Upper Cretaceous, operating in the Plio-Quaternary, operating basically in the Miocene. But we know that even here we developed oceanic crust during the Neogene, during the Miocene. We developed new oceanic basins during the Plio-Quaternary in the Tyrrhenian Sea. They are no longer passive margins. We already start to invert the North African margin, and here you will see we've got North Virgin thrust at the bottom of at the two of the slope. And exactly the same on Western Sicily. All that white line, in fact, it is a North Virgin thrust over the Tyrrhenian Sea. So we can call that probably incipient subduction. And if you look further to the north, we will comment a little bit on the tectonic style in Provence. We'll discuss a little bit the tectonic style in the Gulf of Lion, where Marina is focusing her project. But I would like also to focus on Nice area, on the French Riviera, where we know, again, that here we've got South Virgin thrust developing between the slope and the deep basin. So here, incipient subduction, but here again, incipient subduction. And maybe later, in a few, maybe in 1 million years, instead of having shortening here in that part of the arc, the contraction will be focused in those parts, closing again the Western Mediterranean basin. Okay? So to illustrate that work done by one of our PhD, Mohamed Harab. He's in co-tutel between Algiers and Brest, and Marina is her PhD advisor. and he had access to beautiful seismic data from Western Gecko, which are deep seismic. In fact, he can map the Moho everywhere. And what you see is that you've got a lot of post-Messinian deformation there. And because, of course, of the Messinian salt, you've got gravitational tectonics near the sea level, near the sea bottom. And instead, you've got compressional duplexes below the Messinian salt. So you can have, I would say, a combination between listric normal faults and compressional duplexes. And it is clear that all the seismicity nowadays, and you've got strong earthquakes in Algeria, they relate to that progressive transpressional inversion of the former Miocene margin. Okay? So now I'm jumping across the Mediterranean in Provence, just to show you that a part of the thin skin tectonics of the Alps, we've got in Provence a lot of, I would say, reactivation of basement faults. They can be Permian basins, they can be Jurassic faults, which have been inverted either very early at the same time of the Pyrenean orogeny, or much younger during the Neogene alpine deformation. And here it is obvious that we can compare the seismic images with sandbox experiments just to kill the idea that they relate to thin skin tectonics. Of course, if you are only mapping at the surface, you will see those north-verging thrust. And some people will claim, okay, it is the Pyrenean thrust front. And so then you have to develop thin skin tectonics to connect with the Pyrenees. But it is not here, you've got zero deformation. And it is just shallow accommodation due to the reactivation of deeper basement fault, okay? So, and of course, a lot of the mechanism of the deformation is controlled by the mechanical stratigraphy. And you've got strong contrast between platformal domains, which are more brittle, as compared to basinal domains, which are more plastic, okay? And you see that here, that inversion feature, it is well dated because the Miocene is tilted, okay? So it is Neogene. We had Neogene inversions on the eastern side of the Rhone Valley. What about the western side, where a marina is looking at? When you are looking onshore, you see the Pyrenean thrust front, which is very well exposed nearby Saint-Chinian, but you see that those Eocene thrust has been reactivated negatively during the Oligocene Miocene, just because of the opening of the Gulf of Lion. And when you go further offshore, that's what Marina was speaking about, you see that you've got a huge erosion during the Messinian, you see? And she tried to quantify that, and she proposed to have more than 1 kilometer of erosion. And I agree with her, it is huge. But I would say maybe it has to do something with compression. So maybe we should be more cautious, and maybe of course, a part of the inversions we can document east of the Rhone Valley, maybe there are also some inversion features on that part of the basin. And so it means because of the rigid oceanic lithosphere of the Western Mediterranean, maybe you transmitted part of the deformation across the Mediterranean, accounting for that localization of the deformation, okay? The same type of coupling, decoupling occurs in North Africa, of course, a part of the plio-quaternary inversion of the margin. Here it is a Tethyan margin, which has been inverted already during the Cretaceous, and eventually also during the plio-quaternary. So we had deformation towards the Mediterranean, but we are also deformation towards the African craton. And it is very well documented again by the seismic. On the Onna basin, you see that early phase of inversion and erosion, which is sealed by the Miocene foredip. Sorry. And when you go in the Sicilian Channel between Tunisia and Sicily, you see that the foredip, Miocene foredip, of course, is unconformable on top of early inversion features, but that they have been also reactivated after the Messinian. And as what we discussed for the Adriatic Sea, you see that the flexural basin, the Miocene flexure, is no longer in its initial position. It has been rotated just because there we had already a detachment of the Tethyan slab. It is no longer there to push down the flexure. And that's for Daniel. And I guess he's got a good concern to restore the architecture of the Messinian basins. And here that's the work done by Piero Casero, where he tried to map, in fact, the Messinian foredeep. And you see that in some part, it is still part in the autochtone. In some other part, it is accreted in the thrust belt. And you have to think about that if you want to restore the connection between the western basin and the eastern basin at the time of the Messinian. Because all the Apenninic arc developed after the Messinian. And all the Tyrrhenian Sea basically was opening after the Messinian. So you cannot get a control on those connections without doing some palaspastic restorations. So that's the type of things where you've got in the deep Ionian basin, where again you see the Miocene flexural basin, which postdates early episode of inversion, early episode of coupling between the plate boundary and the foreland. And I guess I'm about to finish. We started with the Pyrenees, where it is obvious that the South Pyrenean thrust front connect directly with the subduction of the mantle lithosphere. So you are dealing with a lithospheric fault. It is not the case in the Apennines, where the amount of shortening you can absorb here at the thrust front has nothing to do with the length of the slab. So you have to imagine that you've got a delamination, a decoupling, and that it is only the mantle lithosphere which is recycled. And instead, the Moho is more or less continuous between the Adriatic and the Apennines. And I guess the same could happen, of course, in the Eastern Mediterranean and in Crete. And as what I show you in Algeria, it is the same in Crete. What you see, it is huge normal faults, gravitational tectonics. What you see in the Hellenic Trench, it is basically extensional fault, but you have to accommodate some shortening. So maybe eventually, below those extensional features, you've got the space to have compressional duplexes. The big question is, what is their paleogeographic affinities? Are they made up of basinal units, like the Ionian Basin, or are they just a lateral extent of the Apulian platform? So could they be of platformal affinities? And I guess that it is a challenge for the industry because the oil potential is not the same in basinal units and platform units. So the philosophy, so the message, is that foredeeps tells you a lot about the lithosphere dynamics. Vertical motion, slab detachment, delamination, all that is recorded by the foredeep sediments. And also, of course, you have to keep, to be very careful because the timing of the foreland inversions, usually they are not coeval with the timing of thin skin tectonics in the foothills. When you've got thin skin tectonics, basically you've got a decoupling between the foreland and the alloctone, and you don't reactivate the foreland structures. So that's why in Africa, in Arabia, you've got pre-thin skin inversions or post-thin skin inversions, but not at the same time. Okay? And for those who are interested in the Mediterranean, I've been asked by colleagues from the Lisbon University to drive a good abstracts for the meetings they are organizing next spring with the AAPG. So it is still time to send abstracts until October 10, and you can just contact Pimentel at Lisbon University for that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, François. So lots of information in the foreland basins. Any questions? And as usual, the youngest among us.
I think that this is a very good talk for people that do not know much about the deep part. However, I'm just thinking of, I looked at the pictures and then you see a lot of wells going to Cretaceous in the Messinian, right? And I don't understand why the information, for example, until the Cretaceous is not really available. Do you know, do you have an explanation for that? For example, like Marina is trying to get that.
So all the wells basically are in the former North African passive margin. So where is the exploration? You've got plenty of wells in the autochtone, in Algeria. You've got plenty of wells in the Adriatic platform and basins. But you don't have any exploration yet in the Western Mediterranean basin. So the situation is that we don't know what is below the salt in the Western Mediterranean basin. And instead, you are right, in the Eastern Mediterranean, there are already a lot of wells on the Nile Delta or in the Levant basin, in the Israel part, not in the Lebanese part yet. The point is, most of the wells there, they were not cored. So eventually, if you got good contacts, and we discussed with the Israeli colleague those days, even for him, it is almost impossible to get access to the data.
This is really ridiculous.
Yes. No, because they cored across the Messinian, of course. Yes. They drilled across the Messinian. So at least you would have the logs. At least you should have the logs.
Okay.
And I guess if the scientific community is involved, the oil companies to consolidate the proposal, because at a certain stage we will need money for that, it would be the time to discuss with them to access those proprietary data, at least to save time and to have some work done already on that, even if it is not coarse, at least to anticipate what are the main
Okay, so I don't think that to be young is only a matter of a number of years, so...
I think, François, it's very important that you present these things here, because especially for the modeling community, and I think this is also in the spirit of Peter Ziegler, who has always told us, look at the seismic reflection data. I think this issue of this compression or reactivation of rifted margins is a very hot topic. Maybe it's interesting to mention here that we have also the evidence for that in the Black Sea. The recent paper by Munteanu, published in EPSL, also backed up by the results of analog tectonic modeling, supporting very much what you just presented for the Mediterranean system.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, maybe one last urgent question?
Not so urgent, really. But this
quick answer?
Yeah. The palinspastic reconstruction you were showing.
No, it is not palinspastically restored. He just mapped the present distribution. So the restoration has to be done. So the type of work that Nadine Elouz and Edouard Roca did for the Carpathians, it could be done for the Apennines and Sicilian accretionary wedge, at least to close the Tyrrhenian and see where was the fall deep in the Messinian time.
Cool. Okay, then there is no question.
Okay, thank you very much. So we move to the next talk by Charlotte Fillon.